France experienced its hottest night since records began almost 80 years ago on Monday, as a severe heatwave continues to engulf swathes of Europe. Across France this Tuesday, schools have been closed and trains cancelled as people desperately try to stay cool in the face of temperatures that have topped 40 degrees Celsius in parts of the country. And the human toll is growing. Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu saying that 40 people, many of them young, had drowned over the past 5 days. Well, for more, we can cross now to our reporter Caroline Baum, who's in central Paris for us. Caroline, you're a very brave woman indeed heading out in these temperatures. How are Parisians coming to terms? How are they coping with these extraordinary temperatures?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you, I guess you can't see, but as you said, the temperatures are absolutely scorching here. Just behind me is the Eiffel Tower, which has closed early today. It's closing at 4 p.m. In the next hour, which means that people here will be turned away. They're advised to go home, stay cool. And it's just another example of how Paris is just not equipped to deal with these kind of heat waves. To give you some context, only 1 in 4 French households has access to air conditioning. So this means that even though there are definitely some people in the camp of hunkering down at home, running the fan, staying inside, a lot of people are looking to cool down outside of their homes as well. They're flocking to green spaces. The city of Paris has made a lot of the city's rare public parks open all night, and there's also lines out the door of pools, as well as many people swimming in the Canal Saint-Martin, which is now authorized by Parisian authorities. Others are going to cinemas, to libraries, museums, anywhere they can get a little bit of air conditioning. But despite these efforts, people are definitely suffering from the heat here in Paris.
And Caroline, these bouts of extreme weather, they're becoming increasingly common, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And the EU has actually warned that Europe is the world's fastest warming continent. It's had really disastrous effects on France. In fact, this heat wave is being compared to France's worst ever heat wave in 2003, which claimed the lives of 15,000 people, mostly the elderly. And so that's just a sobering reminder of just how dangerous these conditions can be. The government is responding. Sébastien Lecornu has gathered 17 ministers for a crisis meeting, but it's definitely raised the debate on how France and Europe more broadly can adapt to these kind of weather conditions.
Caroline Baum reporting there from in front of the Eiffel Tower, which is closing early this Tuesday due to extreme temperatures. Thank you very much. Well, for more on this, we can bring in Dr. Chloe Brimacombe, climate scientist at Oxford University. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on Around the World today on France 24. I read in the Washington Post today that less than 1% of the entire planet was expected to be hotter than France's hottest places this Tuesday. Just how unusual is the extreme weather we're experiencing in France right now?
So this weather for France is actually very alarming, and this heat wave, again, occurring really early in the season. So we also saw record-breaking temperatures in May for parts of Europe, including in France, and this is again happening in June this year. We know that, as you said, that the highest temperature overnight has been broken since records began in France, and we're likely to also break records, and we are breaking record-breaking temperatures in France. The cause of this is hot air rising up from North Africa and causing a plume or a heat dome over Europe at the moment. And this was a similar mechanism that caused the heat wave in 2003, which is the deadliest heat wave in France and across Europe. And that's why comparison is being made. It's because of the humidity as well, so the amount of moisture in the air, which makes it much more difficult for us to cool our bodies down because we can't lose heat for our skin as effectively. And we're seeing a lot of tropical nights, which are nights above 20 degrees Celsius, also across Europe, which really exacerbates our ability to cool down. It's also the length of this heat wave as well. So we might see peaks in temperature at the end of this week, but we are not likely to go back down to temperatures that are, very low, like early 20s even, for the next sort of 14 days. So that shows how intense this sort of period of above average temperatures is going to last for.
And you talked about these elevated levels of humidity in the air. What's behind that high level of humidity?
It's the tropical plume of this specific heat wave. So this is actually an intrusion of tropical air that originates in North Africa. So this means that basically what we would call the wet bulb temperature, which is the amount of moisture in the air, is also a lot higher during this heat wave. And this means that we basically can't cool our bodies down as effectively because we can't lose sweat from the skin because the moisture in the air is already so high. And this exacerbates health conditions. So we've already seen 40 people lose their lives in France, but heat-related conditions, the effects predominantly the elderly or those with pre-existing medical conditions, and causes a rise in excess mortality, is very much exacerbated by the level of humidity in the air because people can't cool down as effectively, even more so than when we just have high temperatures. So it's this combination of these really high temperatures and this humidity that's making it so unbearable and really exacerbating health and well-being conditions across Europe at the moment, including in France.
And you mentioned a little earlier that this isn't just a couple of days, this is a prolonged period of extremely high temperatures. Is it true that these types of extreme weather are lasting longer than they did, say, 20, 30 years ago?
Yes, we know that heat waves are lasting longer. We also know that there's been an increase in sort of the season traditionally that we might see these sort of conditions occurring. So there's new evidence out that suggests that we could be seeing heat waves now occurring earlier, like we did in May, but also later on into later in September. And it really shows that we need to build resilience to heat. So across Europe at the moment, we have seen schools closing because it's just too hot and it's not safe for pupils and teachers to be in those facilities. And I saw a comment on LinkedIn for someone who's a climate education specialist, and she says, if we're closing schools, it's too late, right? We should have really put in place sort of air conditioning or design school buildings so that this heat was they were a safe place for children and their teachers during heat waves. They should be a place where children can go to learn safely regardless of the conditions. And so we need to think about things like that. So in the short term, that was the right thing to do, right? Because it just wasn't safe for people to be there. But can we plan schools for the future so that they are a safe place for pupils to be regardless of the weather conditions around us?
Now, you touched on it just there. There is a huge debate right now in France about what can be done to effectively mitigate the effects of extreme temperatures. You mentioned air conditioning in schools. What, in your opinion, should be the main priorities?
I think a transition to net zero is also very necessary. So we know that if we change our energy usage so that we produce net zero of carbon emissions, that we can stop things like heat waves becoming even more intense, lasting more long and occurring more frequently. And this will help us to make sure that people are less exposed, right? So that's the first main thing we can do. In terms of adaptation, we need to prioritize in all European countries, including in France, access to cooling in places like hospitals, care homes, and educational settings, so that the people that we know are most vulnerable to extreme heat have a safe place to go during these conditions. And actually, France has been very good in terms of early warning, and there's also been policy developments for heat in France in recent years. So although, there are calls for more to be done, I think the framework is in place in a country like France to really be able to make this much better quite rapidly as these sort of events continue to occur. So that's quite promising. So I think the thing is the solutions are in front of us. We just have to have sort of the action so we can put in place these solutions to limit the impacts becoming even worse for people in European countries.
Now, at the beginning, I asked you if these sorts of temperatures were unusual. I now want to ask you about whether or not you're surprised when you see these sorts of extraordinary temperatures, because we are seeing them more and more often. Has your capacity to be surprised by these extreme weather events been somewhat diminished?
It's a good question. So I was perhaps surprised by the fact that this heat wave was going to again threaten 40 degrees Celsius in the UK and break records across Europe. I wasn't necessarily surprised by the length of it. I was surprised by the intensity, because when we had the 40 degrees Celsius threshold passed in the UK in July 2022, which is the first time for that country, they said that there was only 50% likelihood of it occurring again in the next 10 years. So for that threshold to be sort of threatened again 3 years after, 4 years after that record was broken, just shows that actually there's a lot to learn about heat waves, and perhaps we have been a little bit conservative in thinking about how intense they actually could become in Europe. And it definitely shows that we need to roll out solutions and adaptation more quickly. So I was surprised by the intensity of this heat wave and alarmed by maybe the fact that we weren't as prepared or sort of aware of how intense it could be.
And then my last question, as a climate scientist, what would your main advice be to authorities when it comes to creating responsible, effective climate policy? You mentioned net zero before, but that is, it has to be said, a lofty goal, and we are already falling way behind where we need to be to achieve anything close to net zero.
Yes, definitely. So something that I have experienced in recent weeks is I now work on a project with social and political scientists. So when we talk about climate policy, a lot of the time, these goals in terms of net zero and these numbers are created by climate scientists with the physical background, right? So our understanding is very much more around the exposure, how it could get worse, and then perhaps the impacts. But what we really need, and this is the case for all climate change, is we need to be talking to a cross-section of scientists and getting them to work together and funding and facilitating that. Because you'll get the best policy solutions and the evidence if you have scientists from across different backgrounds working together. So the political scientists that I work with look at the development of climate policy within sort of things like the structure of the state of France, and they would understand how to translate sort of a climate scientist's ideals of a threshold or an early warning system or some of these solutions into the actual policy mechanisms that exist. So that's really important because sometimes it's not well understood. So I think it's about working together and actually facilitating and funding that and encouraging that would be really great, because then we'll get better policy solutions.
Dr. Chloe Brimacombe, a climate scientist at Oxford University in the United Kingdom, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us on France 24 today.